So we're continuing our series on the theology of Dr. Seuss. As I mentioned last week, all stories have a context. Last week's story, we looked at the Sneetches, was written in the midst of the civil rights movement in the 60s, focusing on trying to bring people together instead of dividing people between them and us. But Seuss, like all of us, had blind spots. All right. As a son of a German immigrant, he was very sensitive to the prejudice that he and his family experienced after World War I as they were living in this country. During the build-up to World War II, as I mentioned last week, he was a political cartoonist, very much an outspoken an opponent of this America First movement that thought that our interest should only be with Americans and who cares about anyone else, putting self-interest above others. And the danger with that dehumanized, enabled unthinkable treatment of other people. But his blind spot was that after the Japanese entered the war, after Pearl Harbor, he sort of lost sight of that. And so he really was quite racist and stereotypical. He didn't see any contradiction against rounding up Japanese and putting them in detention centers, American citizens in detention centers during the war. It wasn't until after the war he visited Japan. He saw the devastation of the bomb, and he realized Japanese were people just like us. And so he writes a book. The book he writes is Horton Hears a Who. And the whole idea was, he says, a person is a person, no matter how small. He says, just because we don't see them doesn't mean they aren't important. And he dedicates it to the people of Japan. Anyway, what happens around us, context, makes us huge different on how we look at the world and even the stories that we share. So the story from Seuss today was written back in the 70s. And one of the things that was happening then, Vietnam was winding down, but what was ramping up was an environmental movement. 1970, they had the very first Earth Day, right? And this growing awareness, the consequences of polluting our world. So that's really the context where then Dr. Seuss in 1971 writes a book called The Lorax. It's a little long to read the whole book, so I'm just going to read some portions of it. But it starts like this. It says, at the far end of town where the grickle grass grows, the wind smells slow and sour when it blows. No birds ever sing except old crows, is the street of the lifted Lorax. And goes on then to tell the story of a young boy who comes to say, why is the world the way that it is? And why was the Lorax lifted away? And the boy finds an old, odd dwelling where someone called the Onceler lives. And he convinces the Onceler to tell him the story, and this is how the story goes. It all started way back, such a long, long time back, way back in the days when the grass was still green and the pond was still wet and the clouds were still clean, and the song of the swummy swans rang out in space. One morning I came to this glorious place. And I first saw the trees, the truffula trees, the bright-colored tufts of the truffula trees, mile after mile in the fresh morning breeze. And under the trees I saw brown barreloots frisking around in their barreloot suits. They played in the shade, they ate truffula fruits. And from the rippleless pond came a comfortable sound of the humming fish humming while splashing around. But those truffula trees, all my life I've been searching for trees such as these. The touch of their tufts was much softer than silk. They had a sweet smell of fresh butterfly milk. I felt great leaping of joy in my heart, for I knew what I'd do. I unloaded my cart. In no time at all, I'd built a small shop. Then I chopped down a truffula tree with one chop. And with great skillful skill and great speedy speed, I took a soft tuft, and I kneaded a thneed. The instant I finished, I heard a great gazump. I looked and saw something pop out of the stump of the tree I chopped down. It was sort of a man. I describe him. That's hard. I don't know if I can. He was shortish and oldish and brownish and mossy. He spoke with a voice that was sharpest and bossy. Mister, he said with a sawdusty sneeze, I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees. I speak for the trees, for the trees have no tongues. What I'm asking you, sir, at the top of my lungs. He was very upset. He shouted and puffed, what's this thing you've made out of this truffula tuft. Look, Lorax, I said, there's no cause for alarm. I chopped down just one tree. I'm doing no harm. I'm being quite useful. The thing is a thneed. A thneed is a fine something that all people need. It's a shirt, it's a sock, it's a glove, it's a hat. It has many uses. Yes, far beyond that. You can use it for carpets, for pillows, for sheets, for curtains, or covers for bicycle seats. The Lorax said, Sir, you're crazy with greed. There's no one on earth who would buy that fool thneed. But the very next minute, I proved he was wrong, for that very minute a chap came along. He thought the thneed I knitted was great and happily bought it for $3.98. The Onceler then calls his family, and they build a huge factory, and they start producing thneeds, right? And so it goes on for a little while, and then, baby, oh, how my business did grow. Now chopping one tree at a time was too slow. So I quickly invented my super axe hacker that whacked off 4 truffula trees at one smacker. We were making thneeds 4 times as fast as before, and that Lorax, he didn't show up anymore. But the very next week, he knocked at my new office door. He snapped, I'm the Lorax who speaks for the trees. You seem to be chopping as fast as you please, but I'm also in charge of the brown barreloots who played in the shade in their barreloot suits and lived happily eating truffula fruits. Now, thanks to your hacking my trees to the ground, there's not enough truffula fruit to go round. My poor barbaloots are getting all crummies because they have gas and no food in their tummies. They loved living here, but I can't let them stay. They have to find food. I hope that they may. Good luck, boys, he cried and sent them away. I, the Onceler, felt sad as I watched them all go, but business is business. Business must grow, regardless of crummies and tummies, you know. I meant no harm. I truly did not, but I had to grow bigger, so bigger I got. I biggered my factory, I biggered my roads, I biggered my wagons, I biggered the loads of thneeds that I shipped out. The Lorax comes back, right? Because the pollution from this factory then is filling the air with smog, and so he sends the swans away. The water is so polluted that the humming fish have to leave, and the Lorax comes and pleads for the Onceler to stop, but the Onceler gets mad. So it goes on, he says, all you do is yap, 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 saying bad, 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 bad. Well, I have my rights, sir, and I'm telling you I intend to go on doing just what I do. For your information, you Lorax, I'm figuring on biggering and biggering and biggering and biggering and turning more truffula trees into thneeds, and everyone needs. And at that very moment, I heard a loud whack. From outside the fields came a sickening smack of an axe on a tree. We heard the tree fall, the very last truffula tree of them all. No more trees, no more thneeds, no more work to be done. So in no time, my uncles and aunts, every one, all waved me goodbye and jumped in their cars and drove away under the smog-smuggered stars. Now, all that was left beneath the bad-smelling sky was my big empty factory, the Lorax, and I. Lorax said nothing, just gave me a glance. He gave me a very sad, sad backward glance as he lifted him up by the seat of his pants. I'll never forget the grim look on his face when he hoisted himself and took leave of this place through a hole in the smog without leaving a trace. And all that the Lorax left here in this mess was a small pile of rocks and one word, unless. Whatever that meant, well, I just couldn't guess. That was a long, long ago. But each day since that day, I've sat here and worried away. Through the years, while my buildings have fallen apart, I've worried about it with all of my heart. But now, says the Onceler, now that you're here, the word of the Lorax seems perfectly clear. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. So catch, called the Onceler. He let something fall. It's a truffula seed, the last one of all. You're in charge of the last of the truffula seeds, the truffula trees that what everyone needs. Plant a new truffula, treat it with care, give it water and feed it fresh air. Grow a forest, protect it from axes that hack. And the Lorax and all of his friends may come back. All right, so that's the story Dr. Seuss tells. Caring for the earth is not just a good idea. It's literally, if we look at the scripture, it's our vocation as human beings. The book of Genesis says God creates human beings for a purpose, to take care of the creation that he has made. We heard it echoed a few minutes ago in Psalm 8. We've been given dominion, which is not permission to do whatever we want. It's a charge of stewardship, to take care of all that God has done. When Paul writes to the Corinthians about the work of reconciliation, the work of redemption that God is doing, he talks about it's not just for people, but for all creation. If anyone gets it, it should be we who live in Wisconsin, right? I mean, this is where John Muir grew up, where he discovered his love for creation was here in Wisconsin. Aldo Leopold, and reflected on its interconnection of creation. Gaylord Nelson, helped legislate, create Earth Day, and this modern environmental awareness that we have. All these roots from here, right here, Wisconsin. Unfortunately, we live in a time where sometimes profits are put ahead of the care of creation, where environmental protections are being rolled back instead of being made better, because they get in the way of unrestrained economic growth. But without some kind of compass, without a moral compass, capitalism can just turn into greed. We live in a strange time, right, where an oil lobbyist is the head of the Department of the Interior. A coal lobbyist heads the Environmental Protection Agency. A pharma lobbyist is in charge of Health and Human Services. A weapons manufacturing lobbyist is the head of the Department of Defense. I mean, what could go wrong? There's danger, unless, right? That was the message from the Lorax. Unless, he says, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. What we do matters. We've been given a task. Care for creation. If faith doesn't get translated into action, it's not worth much, right? And so when we talk about climate change and environmental protections, we're not just talking about politics and stuff like that. We're talking about what is our purpose, what is our calling as people, as a matter of faith, to care for God's creation. There's a wonderful little hymn, and band, you guys start wandering back up here. It's called "This Is My Father's World." And it's a relatively new hymn, being that it was written, it's less than 100 years old, all right? It was written by a Presbyterian minister who lived in New York. His name was Malby Babcock. It wasn't published, the poem wasn't published until after he died, and then was set to music. Now, one of the things that Babcock liked to do was walk along the Niagara Escarpment in upstate New York. You guys know the Niagara Escarpment, what that means? If anyone been to Door County? So Door County is the Niagara Escarpment. It's all those rocks, those cliffs and everything that goes up through Door County, goes up and forms most of the Upper Peninsula, comes down through Canada, and ends down there at Niagara Falls in upstate New York. It's this beautiful, these dolomite columns of stone. And Babcock used to love to walk along the escarpment. And when he told his wife he was going out to walk, he says, "I'm going out to walk in my Father's world." And then he wrote this poem, which got put to music about my Father's world. So I invite you, we've been sitting for a while, if you want to stand, I invite you to do that as well. Let's sing together a little bit of "This Is My Father's World."